All right. An official welcome now to how Impero simplifies SOX compliance, maintaining an audit-ready internal control environment. Really great to see so many of you joining us here online today. Before we kick it off, I did just want to go through a few good things for you to know. The webinar is being recorded and we will share it afterwards via email. So if there is someone else in your organization that you would like to share this with as inspiration, you are very welcome to do so. We'll also share the slides. It'll also be available on demand afterwards on impero.com as well as our YouTube channel. And you can also find a myriad of our other webinars there as well, in case you're curious to explore more. We'd encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. Please do feel free to use the Q&A button in Zoom to do that, but we will address all of the questions at the very end of the webinar. And what we're covering today. Well, we just went through some of the welcome and practical information, and we'll give a little bit more insight into that. But today we're really focusing on what SOX is and what it requires and how it impacts internal control and audit expectations, as well as how to structure your ICFR and control framework to support SOX compliance, and then practical steps for documenting, testing, and evidencing of control effectiveness. And William's going to take us through what that SOX workflow looks like in the Impero platform in practice. And then we'll finish it off with the Q&A. A quick introduction to us, if you're not familiar with us. We're Impero. We are a B2B software as a service company founded by auditors in 2013. We are publicly listed on NASDAQ First North, and we offer a flexible risk and internal control platform for our finance, tax, and compliance teams based on the COSO framework, and that's William's going to jump in and show a little bit about that, serving a large amount of different enterprise companies in Denmark, Germany, but also around the world. A lot of the companies we serve have entities all over. And so our platform really helps them to collaborate with their local colleagues on a global and local regulatory level, which is often the case of what's important when it comes to SOX compliance. Hosted here in Europe, of course, all about security and transparency on that front as well. That's a little bit about Impero as a company and a platform, and we'll dive into a little bit more on that later. But I did also want to make sure that we had time to quickly introduce ourselves. William, do you want to go first?
Yes, love to. So thank you everyone for joining this morning. My name's William, and for those I haven't met through our work at Impero, I'm on the implementation team here. So working a lot with new clients during the onboarding process, making sure we're taking your existing framework and translating it into something hopefully more effective within Impero, but also doing a lot of these demos and webinars as well, showing off different use cases and what you can actually use the system for. So today we'll be talking SOX, and I'll be walking through the platform in just a little bit here, showing off a very typical use case, what we commonly see with our clients who are using Impero for SOX compliance.
Fantastic. Thanks, William. And we're so happy to have you on here with me today because you are the true expert in how to set things up in our platform. And I think one thing I'd be remiss not to mention as well is that the flexibility of our platform also means that and we'll showcase that in a moment, but really means that we can set up according to your business's needs. So yes, you may be looking at SOX compliance or other regulations, but we know that there's also unique cases from business to business. And that's a lot of what William works with in the onboarding and implementation processes, adapting that to your business's needs. My name is Jasmine Hansen de Guzman. I am the marketing director here, and I'll just simply be the moderator and facilitator here today. Before we jump into a little bit more of the meat on the bones of today's webinar, we did want to do a little poll. So I'm launching that now, and it should appear on your screens in just a second. And it's how far along are you with regards to SOX compliance? And William, when we do get customers in, or when you're speaking to prospects, how far are they normally in their SOX journey? Have they started yet, or what do you typically see?
I mean, in most cases, when people come to us, they already have some pretty good practices in place. Generally, you'll have something documented in the way of your risks and controls. And what we help out with, again, as I mentioned, is kind of streamlining and making those controls more effective. And really we're all about reducing clicks and making the whole process as simple as possible. And I hope that'll come through when we show the platform a bit later on. But yeah, we typically do see some kind of groundwork already laid when we're onboarding new clients.
Fantastic. And I think I'm going to share the poll results because I'm sure that resonates. It's a little bit of a mix, but we have about 22% who are just about to get started with SOX. So kudos for you guys for being here. 11% you're already started the journey 1 to 3 years in. Maybe you're using a platform already. Maybe you're doing it manually, which we know is possible, but it's definitely a very labor and resource intensive way to do it. 44% of you have been subject to SOX for some time, and 22% of you, SOX is not yet in scope, but we know, and I'm going to cover that a little bit, it is something that is continuously brought up in organizations to advance their financial reporting and compliance. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights in the poll. Um, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I figured William and I were discussing this before we logged on that if you're joining a webinar on how to streamline SOX compliance, you most likely do know what it is and how it's impacting your internal control and audit expectations. But for the sake of it, just in case you are not aware, Sarbanes-Oxley, or shortened as SOX, is a landmark U.S. federal law that was really focused on strengthening internal controls and financial reporting, and it was passed in the wake of some really high-profile corporate scandals in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think the big ones that are always mentioned are Enron and WorldCom. I know we always use Enron internally as an example when we're onboarding new employees of this is why risk and internal controls is so important. This is why audit readiness is so important. And so SOX was really introduced to make sure that there was better corporate governance practices, transparency, and accountability. And while it is a US federal law and mandatory for all companies listed on the US stock exchange, we do see it scope extending far beyond and seeing international companies as well that are potentially preparing for an IPO or potentially looking to go into the US uphold SOX as part of their financial accounting reporting standards to ensure that they have that very high level of transparency and trust. William, anything to add to that?
No, I think you pretty much explained it all. I mean, SOX is very much focused around the financial processes and financial reporting, but it's not limited there. So we're also talking about your IT controls, maybe your overall entity level controls, and that kind of goes to what we're alluding to with the use cases at Impero. Yes, we're going to focus on financial processes today, but the scope can be much bigger than that, and we can incorporate these other areas as well.
Fantastic. And the really practical requirements, just calling out a couple of that, Section 302 mandates that the CEOs and CFOs, so C levels, are personally certifying the accuracy of financial statements and disclosures. I know there's been some comparison between SOX and the Provision 29 in the UK that has a lot of buzz around right now, where the board level needs to certify not necessarily the accuracy of financial statements and disclosures, but the internal control effectiveness. So really bringing it up to a higher level. Section 404 is also ensuring that management and auditors are assessing and reporting on the effectiveness on internal controls. William's going to showcase a little bit of that as well and how to streamline that, because again, that can be doing those effectiveness tests can be very, very time consuming as well. And then, of course, what is compliance without any penalties? So also part of SOX compliance and why it is so strict and why you need systems and structure and technology in place to help you uphold it is because there are stricter penalties with regards to tampering in the financial reports and records. And before we go into a little bit more of the practical stuff, we did also want to ask you, what's your biggest pain point today? Because I've mentioned several times, and I'm about to launch the poll, I mentioned several times that you probably could try to get SOX compliance without a tool. A lot of people that we speak to as well who are not yet using a platform are doing it manually through Excel and SharePoint and email. And that probably sounds familiar to some of you. But what's your biggest pain point? And William, when you talk to prospective clients or customers of ours, what is their biggest headache when it comes to SOX?
I think that the main example we usually use is for organizations that are coming from an Excel-based system where you might not have the same level of traceability or ownership. And that's really what SOX is about. It's ensuring accuracy through ownership and continuous improvement. And sometimes when you're working on a very manual system, you don't have that same functionality built in. And so with Impero, I think the one big benefit we can offer is having that all rolled up into one package. And I think we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides.
Ab-
Some practical benefits
Absolutely.
of it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think what you said, William, is spot on with what's being showcased here in the poll results, which I just shared. So 60% of you are struggling with manual documentation and follow-ups, incredibly time consuming to have to follow up with people again and again. Hey, can you please send me that? And I think that goes hand in hand with the 30% of you who are struggling with evidence collection. Again, incredibly time consuming, manual labor, or not manual labor, but labor intensive in getting responses from people. And then on top of that, which I think is an added layer, 10% of you are struggling with version control and documentation chaos. There's nothing better than getting version 52 of something and trying to figure out if that's the right thing to provide to your auditors. But again, thanks for sharing your insights. And with that, I will hand it over to you, William, to talk a little bit about how we can help and what our perspective is on this.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine. I think to start out, we want to talk about big picture. What does Impero offer in the way of running a SOX use case? And like I mentioned, the main thing is centralization around combining all of these features that will show you clear ownership, traceability, all in a single platform. And this means your risks, your controls, and the evaluations as well. And so what we're offering in that sense is a way to track the ownership, the status, and performance of your internal controls related to your risks. Automation and flexibility, we've kind of mentioned this a few times now, in that the platform isn't necessarily limited to one use case. So we can start out somewhere and then expand further from that point. And automation in the sense that once you build your controls in Impero, it's kind of a set it and forget it. You can keep running these same controls over and over again on a recurring basis without having to come in every month and make adjustments. And finally, around reporting, part of the SOX requirements are definitely about this high level management reporting of how the controls are actually working. And that's something we can also facilitate in the platform. You can get more than just the status of your controls, but we can look at reports built around effectiveness as well. And that's something I'll get a little more into as we walk through the platform. In practice, what this actually means is making the most out of the major modules within Impero. So those of you who have used the system before, you might be familiar with risk management, control management, and reporting. And we're really using all of that in order to build a SOX use case. So obviously, we'll start in risk management to identify and assess our risks in scope for SOX. And then within the control module, that's where we're actually performing the mitigating controls, as well as measuring the effectiveness through both some self-assessment questions and the control testing module. And finally, reporting, as I mentioned, just a way to share this data through your different streams within your organization to make sure the right people are getting the overviews that they need.
Awesome. I think we're going to hand it over to you to actually jump in live and show us how it's done. So I'll stop sharing and hand it over to you, William.
Great. Just let me know when you can see the screen.
And it's loading, and there we go. All good.
Perfect. All right. So this is Impero for those of you who haven't seen it before. And I always start these demos by saying for the people actually performing controls and tasks within the system, they might not ever see this screen. Part of what we do is, again, trying to make the whole process as simple and user-friendly as possible. So for your control performers, they'll be notified via email that they have a new task to perform. They'll follow a link, do their job, and then they're done. What I'll show here is much more for your administrative side, the people building your risk directories, designing controls, and managing the reports, and so on. As I mentioned, there's a few major modules or primary modules that we'll use for a SOX use case. I'll start out in risk management, jump over to controls, and finish up with reporting and control testing. So starting on the risk side of Impero, this is usually the first stop for our clients who are taking a risk-based approach to SOX. We organize risk within directories and entities. So directories being sort of a folder that will contain all of your risks, and entities being the individual items that are owning or taking on the risk. And you'll see as I go along, a lot of things in Impero are self-defined, and that's by design because we want to be flexible to accommodate use cases. I mean, definitely SOX, but outside of SOX as well. So in this instance, I've named my entities a few different business units, but this could also be individual teams or departments within your organization, depending on the risk ownership. I'll take my business process risks directory here because this is the most applicable to SOX. It'll contain my financial business process and those risks. Inside of the directory, we organize via these different processes, and underneath them, the risks themselves. When you're creating a risk in Impero, you'll start out with a name, description, decide if it's a global risk or a local risk, so only applying to certain entities or all of them. And then we can collect some background data on the risk. And one thing we like to point out here is that we're very flexible in how we can build these sections up on the risk side. So if you're looking to collect some other data points outside of these default values that we have, we can add these in for you as well. And we've even done some basic risk calculations and scoring within this section also. Once you've created a risk and assigned it to your entities, you have access to the risk map. And this is the COSO heat map you're probably familiar with, showing the impact likelihood ratings of all of the risks within the directory. We can switch between the inherent view and residual view. So after we've applied our mitigating action, what does our risk landscape look like? And each of these numbers is corresponding to the number of risks that have been rated at a level. So here, if I click on this 5, I'll see a filter automatically applied for all risks rated as a medium impact and an unlikely likelihood. We also have a historical data tab, so you can get a snapshot of your risk environment at a given point in time. It's useful for doing a lot of comparisons and seeing how your risk is progressing. And I know we're also doing a lot of really exciting development work around that I won't spoil too much, but definitely looking forward to that as well. A little further down, this table is just the overview of everything you'll see in the heat map. So it's individual risks assigned to entities. And this is also where we'll be doing our risk assessments as well. So if I take this first order to cash risk, I see all the background information on the risk, the different data points we added in when we first created it. And then I can start doing my actual assessment. So I would start out by giving it an inherent impact, likelihood, and then I have to choose how to respond to my risk. So if I mark it as not applicable, transfer, avoid, accept, I kind of just take the risk at face value. Otherwise, when I'm reducing my risk, this is where we do some follow-up assessments on it. So what would be the residual impact? Maybe it's down to a medium, and the likelihood may go all the way down to remote. I can add some comments in here about what we're actually doing, or we can tie it back to the Impero control module here through mitigating actions. So I see here is my order to cash risk. I can search for all of my controls here and apply whatever risk or control, we're using to mitigate the risk. When I select that, I get background information on the control itself, and I can actually select how much of the risk this control is actually covering. When I add that, I can complete my assessment here. And all of the changes I've made here are saved and logged. And this really applies for everything you do within the system. We're very big on traceability and having the full history of changes for whatever you're doing in Impero, whether that's assessing risks or creating and performing controls. We want to have this full history so you know exactly who is doing what and when within the platform. Over to the control side of Impero now. When you first log in, you'll be met with this dashboard overview, which is kind of giving you just a very quick snapshot about your overall status for a given period. Here I'm looking at the current quarter. You'll see your completion rates and on-time rates for every control program that you have access to as a control manager. On the actual building and structuring of your controls in the system, it's organized also a bit like the risk side in that we're organizing our controls in different folders we call control programs, each one of these containing the controls that are actually going out. So here's my control program for order to cash, and within that I might have all of my controls covering this particular financial process. But these are all self-defined, again, so you can call these whatever you want and structure them in a way that matches how you're currently working in whatever setup you have right now. If I click here, this is now opening up an individual control, and now we're on Impero's control design page. And a lot like risk, we'll start out giving it a name and description, but from here you can kind of think of controls in Impero as a template. And this assignment table will actually determine how many instances or copies of the control are going to be sent out. And we can differentiate between these based on our tagging system. So these are all self-defined categories and tags. You can see I've applied a few at the control level, that this is an IT-dependent control in terms of automation, how frequent it's going out, whether or not it's a key control for us. Really, whatever information or data points you think you might need to filter on your reporting later on, we would typically recommend you apply as a tag on your controls. A very common one we see might be an entity, business unit, country or region, so on. And when you apply this at the assignment level, these will be attached to the individual control activities. So when you're looking for them later on in your reporting, you can just search by each of these tags and pull up the relevant activities you might need for any given report. When we're actually making the assignment, we can have up to 3 users involved in a workflow: a first responsible user who's actually performing the control, and then up to 2 reviewers. You'll see in this case, I've actually assigned an entire team to perform this control. So if you have something where your finance team might be performing a reconciliation or a control, you can assign all of them to perform it together. And that way you have the opportunity, if someone, say, is out of office or goes on vacation, someone can always step in to perform the control for them. When you've assigned all of your controls and tagged them, we have a few different options here. And one particularly relevant to SOX is the segregation of duties, in that we want to have complete independence of the same person shouldn't be both performing and reviewing the work. So when we enable that, you'll see I have an error here because I'm both performing this control and reviewing it. So we have these sort of limits built into the system that'll catch these errors before they actually go out on live controls. A little further down, we have a scheduling section. So we can send out controls as a manual, just a single one-off basis. We can send it immediately as soon as you save it. And this is typically used if we have some sort of remediation action or an audit finding where you only need to perform the control once. You can select it as a manual control here. Otherwise, in most cases, we see controls going out on a recurring basis. And here you would select the interval that they're going out, whether that's weekly, monthly, quarterly, so on, what time period the control should be covering. And then you can set the due date, months, days before or after the beginning or end of the period for this control. If you have a bit of a unique schedule where, say, the control is not going out one month and another month you have a different due date, we can account for all of that on a customized monthly, quarterly, what have you schedule. And down here in the planning section, we actually set the amount of working days each user has to perform their part of the control. So you'll see if I update these numbers here, my preview on this side will also update. So I always have a complete picture of when exactly the next instance of this control will be sent out, when it'll be due for each user and reviewers. A little bit further down, we have reminders, and these are just email notifications that can go out up to 365 days before or after the due date of the control. And these are aware of where the control is at in the workflow as well. So if the responsible user has completed their part and it's sitting with the reviewer, only the reviewer will be getting the notifications, not the responsible. The final section here is the fun part where you're actually building the tasks on your control. And we've tried to make this as straightforward as possible. It's a no-code drag and drop interface where you're building tasks from top to bottom. And in this case, you can see I have a few different question types, single choice, we can do checklists, comment fields, so on. We can do some limited logic on these as well. So if the response to an earlier question goes a certain way, we can show or hide other tasks. Otherwise, it's very straightforward. Put in the name of the task, any instructions. You can format this with a bulleted list or link to external documents. But you can also upload files directly on to the controls you're sending out as well. So if you need to refer back to a manual, some other documentation, or an Excel sheet, you can just attach that directly here. So it's available, and some file types can even be previewed directly in browser. So you don't need to download it, look at the file, and then go back to perform your controls. The last option here is also forcing tasks to be required. So if you want to make sure that you're receiving evidence or a file upload on your controls, you can tick this box so it can only be submitted if that task has actually been performed. It works the exact same for the responsible and for your reviewers. You'll just switch tabs and then build the tasks into the control design here. You can preview it once you've built it, but I think what I'll do instead of that is just show exactly what it will look like to perform a control in Impero. And I think I mentioned earlier, in most cases, you'll receive an email notification with a link to perform the task. Otherwise, you can access your pending actions up here in the dashboard. Performing a control would look something like this. When you follow the link, you'll be brought to this page where you get all the background information on the control, including the scheduling, when it's due for everyone, and any tags attached to the control as well, so you know exactly which entity or business unit you're performing it for. As a responsible user, I can go through, perform my tasks, upload documentation. I can save it and come back later, or just go ahead and submit, leaving some comments for the reviewer as needed. And for the reviewers, it works pretty much the same way. I'll receive a notification when the control is ready for review. First thing I'll see is any comments that were left by the first user. I can review the work they did and then do my own work as the reviewer. So in this case, I've built in a checklist to make sure that everything's been done. If I need to upload any evidence or comments. And down here, we start getting into some questions that we built specifically for a SOX use case. So one thing with SOX is very big around measuring control effectiveness. And this is sort of the first step that we have in this in the form of a self-assessment question here. And all it is a single choice question where we're asking the reviewer to rate how effective they think the control has been. If they mark it as effective, that's great. Maybe you don't need any follow-up action there. But conditionally, if I select partially or not effective, maybe I need to check if there's any remediation or corrective action required to the control here. If I select yes, we've also built in a text header with a link to create a new manual control that you can actually use to track these remediation and corrective actions for each control that you might need. As a reviewer, I can approve the control and submit it, or I can return it to the responsible with comments if I notice something needs to be corrected, and that'll just restart the workflow of the control. In this case, I think everything's great. I'll notify the first user, and I will submit. And now I have fully performed a control in Impero. I'll jump over to the reporting side now. And by default, what we're showing is a status, sort of like the main dashboard page here, just showing how the controls are looking for a given time period. But we have a lot of different filtering options here based on all of the tags that you've attached to the controls in the assignment. So you would select a time period you want to look at for the report. and what you want to display in terms of your columns or the data points in the report. In this case, I'm looking at the tag I created for business units. So I can see all of the controls sent out for business unit 100, 200, and where all of them are at based on my time period. So I can see how many are completed, how many are completed on or after the due date, if I have any overdue, pending, and so on. But you can really use, like I mentioned, any other information attached to the control to build the report. So say you want to look at the control program it's coming from, or even the individual users who is responsible for the control. You can see that here as well. And I've been quite busy the previous quarter in this environment. A little bit further down, it's just like the risk map. You have a data table, so the breakdown of the visualization you see above, and you can organize this in a lot of different ways by the grouping. So if you want to look from the program level first, going down to control and business unit, you can really drill down into the data you're collecting within the reporting module. A lot of times you might want to follow up on, say, overdue controls, and that you can do by clicking here in the overdue column. I see I have a total of 3 overdue controls, and when I click into that, I'm brought to the activities view, where as an administrator, I have a few options in terms of sending reminders or reassigning controls. And to go one step further, I can actually click into the control activity to see exactly what's been done and what might still need to be done on a given control activity. In terms of management reporting, once you have applied filtering to a report and saved it, you can actually send out push reports as well. So if you have someone who's not necessarily involved in the control workflow, but still needs to see how everything's doing, we can facilitate that within the system as well. And it can be a single ad hoc report, or you can send these out on a recurring basis. So every month, quarter, someone can receive an overall status of the most recent period that your controls are covering. This is a very default report, but we can go a step further and actually start looking at the individual questions and building reports around those. So the self-assessment effectiveness question I showed earlier, we can map those responses to data columns and build a report around that as well. So here I'm looking within the same Q1 of this year. And now what I've done is taken those responses and created them as columns. So here I can see exactly how many controls have been rated as effective, not effective, partially effective, and how many answered yes to whether or not a remediation is required. And it follows the same logic. So if I want to check out my not effective controls, I can look at the data table down here, click into the activities tab, and now I have a full overview of all of the controls that were rated as not effective by the reviewers. So this is really helpful when you want sort of a first line snapshot or general feeling about how the controls are performed and their effectiveness. But the final module I'll show today takes that a step further into a little more formal testing method. So this is our control testing module. And this would be conducted by, say, your internal audit team or some other external reviewer when they want to take this deep dive into how your controls are actually working in practice. Control tests are organized a lot like control programs in that you would first create a testing program, giving it a name, description. You can set access to the program. The main difference is that you'll build tasks on the program level. And when it comes to control testing, we're making 2 conclusions. One on the samples we'll be pulling into the test, and these are the individual control activities being performed month to month, quarter to quarter, and so on. And also on the control level as a whole. So what do these individual samples say about the performance or effectiveness of the control? Building in tasks to control tests works the same as controls, where you're just dragging and dropping different question types, and we have the same conditionals requirements that we can do when we're building a control test. After you've created the control testing program, you can create the individual tests themselves, and you'll start out by setting the scope of your control test. And that's initially based on tags you've applied to the activities. So say I want to test all of my entities or business units, I could select that entire category and it'll bring all control activities tagged with one of these into my testing scope. Next, we'll be selecting a period. So if I want to take all of last year, for example, I can select January to December. I can enable random samples. Otherwise, when I create the test, I would be selecting individually which control activities I want to bring into the test. And finally, setting a due date and time and the same planning that you see when you're creating control activities. Next, we're actually selecting which controls we want to test as part of this. And here, when I click Add Controls, I'll see this table that's bringing in all controls that had activities performed for my designated scope. And depending on what I want to bring into the test, I can select everything or just a few. And I'll see here exactly how many tests will actually be created. It'll be per entity. So in this case, 3 tests for each control means 3 different entities were performing this control in my time period. The last step is assigning responsible and reviewers, and then I can go ahead and create my tests. When it comes to actually performing a control test, you'll again get an email notification with a link when you've been assigned to create a new test. Otherwise, you saw I can go through a pending actions tab in the control testing module. When I first open it up, I'll see the name, description, and the period and entity that I'm testing. So I can see I'm looking for business unit 200 from last year. And then the first thing I have to do as a tester is actually bring my samples into the test. So when I click on this, I'll see a list of all activities that were performed within my scope. And if I want to perform everything or review everything, I would just select all and bring them into my test. Now I have to start reviewing the individual activities, and I do that by clicking on the first sample. Here is my sample level tasks that I need to perform. So the first question, was the control actually completed? Well, I won't know until I view the activity, and I can do that by clicking on the link here and seeing exactly what was done when this control was originally performed, as well as the full activity history. So when the reviewer had a look at it, when it was actually submitted, and so on. That looked good, so I'll say yes, the control was completed, click OK, and I've performed the first sample level tasks. And you'll notice that this icon over here has changed. So when you view the individual sample activities, it'll be recorded on the test with a timestamp of when you actually looked at it. So you know your control testers are actually looking at the data that they should be looking at when they're performing a test. I'll skip through the rest of these and jump down now to my control level conclusion. So based on all of my sample tests, was this control effective in the last year? Maybe yes, maybe no. You can answer accordingly and then leave comments. And if you've built in other questions here, you could give more detail and record, say, whether there was remediation or corrective action required as part of this using the same workflow I showed earlier around manual controls. From here, I can submit and I'm done. When it comes to reporting on the control testing side, you would access that via the Activities tab here, where you get a list of all tests that were performed, their effectiveness. You can take this table and export it to Excel. Otherwise, we have a lot of different API options within the entirety of Impero around getting control data out to something like Power BI as well if you need to do more advanced data modeling. That is a lot of information to cover in a pretty short amount of time, but I hope the main takeaway, at least, is showing that it can be relatively simple to set up an entire SOX use case within Impero. It doesn't need to be overly complicated, and generally, if you're coming with some kind of framework you already have documented elsewhere, it's a pretty straightforward task translating that over to Impero and then start building and making these tasks that you're already doing more effective through the system. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, William, for that walkthrough. And I think the only thing I'd say is on that one test, we should have commented that we needed segregation of duties because I saw you were the responsible first and second reviewer. So
Yeah, like I mentioned, I'm doing a lot of work in that environment there.
exactly. But it's a good test for everyone on the call too to see if they caught that because
Yes,
that's
yeah.
exactly one of the realistic scenarios, right, that could happen in certain entities and organizations. I'm just going to hop into sharing my screen here again with all of you before we have 5 minutes left for some very quick questions for all of you. I'm going to just launch this poll as well because, of course, William provided a lot of great information there about how Impero can be used, but perhaps you'd like to have a look at, as William said, that you already have an Excel framework or a framework in an Excel, but I will just leave that open. I will also just quickly promote, and before we jump into the Q&A, that we have a ton of great resources in our help center as well. So if you are not familiar with that or would like to dig into it, do check that out. There's also been a lot of questions in the past year with Provision 29 being introduced in the UK, what the difference is. So we have a nice blog post on it. I think we can put that in the follow-up email as well. And of course, follow along with everything we do on LinkedIn and save the date, or you can actually already register now for our Q1 2026 product update webinar, where we keep you updated on all the different things that are happening with the Impero platform. We have a couple of questions that have come in. So let's jump right into it. And if you have any other ones, please do feel free to put them in the Q&A panel, as I mentioned before. You're welcome to do it anonymously. I will just note that if you submit questions anonymously, we may not be able to follow up with you afterwards if there's any additional things to clarify. The first question that we have, and I think, William, you already answered it a little bit, but can the reports in Impero be shared with externals, for example, the board or the CEO or CFO who doesn't normally have access to Impero or a platform similar?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that goes back to the push reports I mentioned when going through the reporting modules. So you don't necessarily need to be involved in performing the controls in order to receive reports. You would set up your custom report and then send it out as a push report to those users who might need to see that overview. It works on the individual activity level as well. So when you're doing a control assignment, you can actually include an external user, or I'm sorry, an Impero user who's not performing the control to be notified whenever that control is completed. So typically all the notifications will only go to your responsibles and your reviewers, but we do have the option to include, if you have a higher level manager in Impero who needs to know when a control has been performed, they can be notified as part of the control assignment without actually working on the control.
Perfect. The next question we have is, can you help apply SOX to our organization? I can answer that. So Impero as a platform, we cannot apply SOX to your organization, but we provide the technology platform to help, as William has just showcased, streamline that, make that more documented and audit ready. But we do have a ton of great partners. So if you're looking to get SOX compliant and you need help with that, documenting your risks and documenting your controls, we have lots of fantastic partners that I know would love to help you. And then they also know hand in hand how that works with Impero. And William, you've helped with plenty of those kinds of implementations, right?
Yeah, yeah, and we get a lot of good content from our partners as well. So if you're a little unsure about what you're coming in with, it's definitely recommended that we can help you out there, and they're familiar with the system, like you mentioned. So it's a very easy kind of transition for us to go from that content into Impero.
Exactly. And we know SOX implementations can be really long and lengthy sometimes. So that's also a great way to speed up the process if you are chasing a specific deadline. All right, last question that I can see for now, and it is it better to use tags to create, is it better to use tags to tag SOX relevant controls, or is it better to create a dedicated SOX control program? I'm going to let you answer that one, William.
That's the beauty of Impero, is that you could really go either way. I would say it's one of our strengths, and also one of the things that maybe we don't necessarily struggle with, but something we have to think about a little more in the implementation process, is that we are so flexible that there's not one right way to do something. It's very context dependent on your organization. If you're operating with a very wide use case, so you might be doing SOX and IT, SOX and tax, SOX and something else, then definitely tagging based on say the regulatory framework that these controls are covering or coming from is a good way, especially if you have cross overlap between the regulations. So if you're doing your IT general controls for SOX, they might also apply if you're doing, say, ISO 27K, any of the other information security regulations. I mean, the hard answer is that you could do either one. I think from a reporting standpoint, definitely recommended, or at least I would recommend more to lean on tags rather than individual programs. But yeah, it's whatever fits your organization is the best approach always.
Fantastic. And I think that pretty much sums it up on our end. Um, Huge thank you to everyone for listening in and for joining. A huge thank you to you, William, for sharing all of your knowledge and showcasing how Impero can be used for SOX compliance. And we look forward to seeing you another time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.